Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Good to see you. Welcome to all of our wonderful audience members.
Welcome indeed. Yeah, it's
Legion
rainy in
as they
Philly.
are.
Supposed to rain all week.
Ah,
What's that?
I would say legion as they are,
Legion.
our listeners.
Loyal.
Yeah, yeah. Although honestly, I noticed we just in the past day, for the first time ever, we lost one subscriber.
Oh, I wonder why.
And I was like, I admit I took it personally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it happens.
So
Yeah. Okay. Well,
yeah, life
maybe
goes
we'll learn
on.
something from
We're
that.
just
Yep.
we're just gonna muddle forward as
I
we
wish
must.
we could dial in like what episode or what point at what episode
We're
they,
right.
they hit the unsubscribe button.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Okay. Well, so it goes.
Yep.
We talked about something in the last recording that we did that I wanted to expand on and see if I don't know if it's a full episode's worth of content, but let's see where it takes us.
Uh-huh.
There was this I had mentioned a podcast that James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson just did, where they talked about the relationship between individual dysfunctional personalities, like the dark triad or dark tetrad. I don't remember which it is,
Mhm.
um, and and ideology, like what Lindsay calls woke right, or you know, Marxism as an ideology, or what have you.
Mhm, mhm.
And it got me curious about um, the relationship between like the individual personality, uh, I want to say issues or dysfunctions, but there's probably a better word than that, and how those get expressed through mass um, uh, consciousness and vice versa, right? How the mass consciousness impacts the individual personality, because it seems to me there's a maybe the seed of mass consciousness exists in the individual, but there are characteristics of mass consciousness that the individual doesn't manifest, and there's a reinforcing and multiplying relationship between them that is sort of fascinating. So I was curious what your thoughts are about that, and where that might go.
Yeah, well, it's another one of those part whole interface feedback loops. Uh, and I think the interesting thing to me about that uh, is yes, that certain mental world views find certain ideas and certain extensions from built around those ideas as very appealing, reassuring, uh, maybe they become monumental hold down points for an individual's semantic world. And so those ideas start to live in a way because they harmonize with us. I think I might have mentioned somewhere else a book uh, about Reichian therapy called Man in the Trap, where Ellsworth Baker, I think, Dr. Ellsworth. I'm guessing. Show notes. I'll confirm it. Uh, but the whole last part of the book is looking at particular. d- Uh, uh, I don't want to say mental deviations per se, because those are the extremes of the situation. But it's like, there's no hard and fast lines there all the time. There's a zone that we move in and out of and back and forth, and it changes based on life experience and on age. And maybe there's these extreme levels where once we go out beyond those, then maybe we start to say, okay, this is no longer a sustainable functional formula. We're going to call a red flag here. But before we get to the red flag zone, there's still a lot of different predilections and predispositions that one might have for any of a number of reasons, some of which might be explored and some of which might be unexplored. And so, what Ellsworth Baker was trying to do, if that is indeed his name, was to try to associate those, yeah, attached to the work of Wilhelm Reich. And Reich is often associated with orgon and orgon boxes and these crazy things, uh, by the popular narrative. Uh, but he actually wrote the classical sort of Freudian school on character analysis. And the idea of character analysis is actually based on the story of human development, and that we go through certain chapters and certain stages where certain things are developmentally appropriate, and then we transfer to the next one, and it's that chapter idea again. And that at certain chapters different things can happen that can kind of obstruct our development, and therefore it gives a kind of a tweak in our mental world of how things work by affecting our physico-energetic relationship with the world that ideas sort of float on top of, right? And one of my more quotable quotes is that reason is a whore, and it follows whatever the emotional predisposition is that's sort of paying it off to, that's why I say, whatever the argument in court, you can usually pay off an expert, let's just call them air quotes, to make to use reason to make your argument uh, uh, seem the most reasonable. And so that's why I say that reason is not always the final arbiter. Is that in that regard? And I think that's where it takes a certain foundation of intellectual honesty and self-reflective perspective as a foundation to rest your reason machine on before firing it up, because if the thing is tilted at all, anything that comes out of it is going to cut it's going to be crooked. Right. And so, even though the didn't somebody give a formula for that? Start with an illogical premise and then go through a logical process and then arrive at an illogical conclusion. And then you've kind of ensnared people in the logical process, and they didn't get that the whole logical machine was tilted. So anything that gets spit out at the end of the machine is going to be as tilted as the foundation that the logic machine was sitting on. To not overwork, I hope, that metaphor. But this is part of that mystical relationship with ideas, and that they aren't all rational, because we aren't all rational, and why language can extend into dreams and into poetry and into Finnegan's Wake, right? Into all of these things that are just thrown together, associations, and where logic is not maybe the first order of organization.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts that come up in response. One is the taxonomist in me, which is an annoying part of me, I'll admit,
You got to have
wants
names
to,
for things.
yeah, wants to map like a narcissist is going to tend towards totalitarianism and a sociopath is going to tend towards whatever, right? Because I'm like tempted to see the mass ideology as a projection um, that takes on a life of its own, but that is born in the individual psyche. And so I'm tempted to make that kind of one to one connection, and I'm sure it's
Sure.
not a one to one connection. And that brings up the um, the second comment, which is if I really like the idea of the physio energetic um, thing that ideas rest on. and that ideas are never purely rational because we're not purely rational. And so, even the analysis of the personality or the psyche or the mass ideology has these seeds of irrationality in it too. And what
Right,
about that?
right.
Like
Now,
how
see, I would footnote in there that ideas can be rational, but they're always gonna be sitting in a context that is fundamentally irrational. And that's why that gets to that problem that you can't really prove the premise ever. Crazy premise, crazy outcome, no matter how rational whatever in between is. So
maybe
there
you
are
could
rational
explain that.
ideas, and that's why we get that illusion that we can just totalize this whole bad boy. We can just rationalize our way. We can just the quest for certainty is not a fool's errand, right? But yeah, no, there is a whole phenomenon there, and you know what came to me from what you were saying was this idea that yeah, people are because they're affected by their culture and they are affected by their own internal process as well as that setting of culture. When we talked about the idea of tacking into the wind and sort of it's almost like there's cultural guardrails somehow, and we get to a certain point, we kind of rebound off, or we're following a compass heading, and at some point we're not heading where we're going anymore, and we kind of make an adjustment, that sort of thing, and it creates for us a type of zigzag path, right? And that, of course, flashed to me the Hopi prophecy, and that bifurcation between the zigzag path and the planting stick path. And like our last episode where we talked about fruitfulness, this idea that something about nature holds us down and maybe roots that physico energetic reality so that the consciousness that rests on it is not just stable because the organs underneath, so to speak, are stable, but it's stable because the thing that those organs are resting on is stable. And then we keep working our way down to the turtles. Right. But that that there might be some way in which if we don't have that anchor, we can be batted around socio emotionally in a way that if we're resting in our place in a centered way, it's not it's not as easy to get as blown, right? And I mean, I've been thinking about this because I've been thinking about meditation, and particularly because of our conversation with Jeff, and he spoke about his practice of meditation, and I was thinking about sort of that and its role in different settings, and if meditation were medicine, that's what some of us try to do is we try to take medicine and then we don't pay attention to all the poison that we eat the rest of the day because we're taking the medicine. And that what the experience in my life has been was that when I was younger and my own energies were stronger, and when I was more subject to the outer world than a world of my own, an environment of more or less my own, I can't say my own creation, but my own choosing, a more natural environment, I feel like I don't need as strong a medicine. And of course I'm older and all those things, but I mean, I've been thinking about that as far as what are the things that stabilize us, but your question kind of points to what are the things that destabilize us, maybe by mental contagion, by our own attachment, bewilderment, and aversion. uh, so how do we get, again, it's like we're back where we started in some of our first few episodes talking about how to not be blown by the winds, and how do those winds come at us? They don't just come at us as conceptual ideas, although they might, but they usually are ideas that have an emotional attachment. Like, the eight winds for people that weren't with us back then are I got them written up here so as to not forget a wind. prosperity and decline, honor and disgrace, praise and censure, pleasure and suffering. And so, of those pairs, three of those four pairs, they kind of have to do with how we feel about ourselves as reinforced by the congregation of our fellows. Whether we're I guess prosper and decline is maybe more an environmental, like pleasure and suffering, but honor and disgrace, praise and censure, those both kind of speak to how we feel ourselves to be. And
As
so
perceived by others, or
as
as how we
perceived.
see ourselves to be in the context of the collective.
Right,
That's
right.
really interesting.
Yeah, which may or may not, like, I think that that's the other thing that as we were speaking about this was we tend to think in static categories, and we want to remember that all of these things are like time worms, right? They're morphing through time, so that a person might be very liberal, air quotes, when they're young, and then after they are at the other end towards the time worm, they end up showing up as more conservative. And so, so what are the things that change that showing up? A lot of that is contextual, right?
It reminds me of something I saw maybe a couple of years ago about social anxiety really being a fancy word for uh, a fear of humiliation, or a fear, or like a shame that's hanging out, or an embarrassment that's hanging out just below the surface and is really easy to poke. And I've experienced some social anxiety over the years, in certain circumstances in particular, where I felt like I wasn't being myself, and so it was just really hard to play a role in some situations. And so at first I was really resistant to that idea. Like I wanted to believe that social anxiety was like um, a thing, as opposed to just a cover for a much more common and maybe harder thing, more difficult thing. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, it's kind of true, at least for me. I can't say for everybody. And I'm just thinking about that in terms of the way that we're perceived by others, being so much of where the holes are in the armor,
Right.
and how much we're pack animals or tribe animals or whatever you want to call that. And so how we're perceived by others is really a survival mechanism, right? Or we need to belong, we need to feel connected.
Right.
So that kind of just brings up the how much agency and how much of an individual um, are we and can we be, relative to kind of being governed by these winds. And that brings up the question about, like, what's the role of government in terms of supporting individual expression versus the collective good, right?
Right.
That's a example of how this individual psychological thing and the general political thing interrelate.
Sure. Well, and the way that that used to get expressed, and now that we've had the scrambling of the polls, maybe it doesn't apply quite as directly, but we used to say, well, if you have daddy issues, you're a Republican, and if you have mommy issues, you're a Democrat.
Yeah, like that.
Because the traditional thing was that the Republicans were usually the ones wielding the whip, which is using fear and the idea that we're going to protect you from the scary things, kind of a paternalistic sort of thing. And the Democrats were always, we're more like mom. We're just going to give you stuff. You're not really going to have, mom doesn't ask for you to put out. Mom just gives you stuff. That's sort of what mom does. And so now I think things have we're in a much more complicated. That was back in the old simple world. and and I would look at that and say, well, look at how many independents there are. And so that's good. That means that there's maybe some people that have psychologically, gone beyond mommy and daddy issues. Um, but again, I'm sure as a political perspective, I've managed to piss off both sides of the spectrum by that observation. But like I say, things are much more complex than that, obviously, but that kind of is the way that it would get presented. And
Jung might talk about the anima and animus, as a kind of internal, um, archetypal version of mommy and daddy issues, right?
right. Well, and then we get into the high priestess and the hierophant and some of these genderized symbols of authority, both friendly and unfriendly, and that come to represent sort of aspects of collective unconscious forces. And so yeah, and this is all sits within that larger context of conversations about the other and the different ways that that otherness can show up. You know, um, I have learned over the years that my particular perspective is different than what I must what I have come to believe must be other people's experience, sort of by virtue of my early upbringing and uh, non-attachment as a child. And so I think that maybe uh, social, so what was your term? Social anxiety.
Yeah.
Uh, becomes a more generalized thing, and so maybe kids in that condition get more compartmentalized. Um, and I'm
As
thinking,
as I'm thinking about it now, I would attribute it to, I think part of my upbringing involved like, um, having to perform in order to be valued.
right, right, same,
And
same with me. Yeah.
yeah, and so I think the way that played out as an adult, at least, I mean, I'm sure it could still show up, but I've become more aware of it and integrated it to some extent. Is if I'm in a situation where I'm playing a role, as opposed to being more myself, then the pressure that I feel, along with that shows up as anxiety.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, the playing a role idea is sort of an interesting whole topic, and the degree to which our isness can manifest through contexts like that. And the general topic, I felt the same thing, that I sort of had to perform and make everybody happy, and which flashes to me to the Cider House Rules by John Irving, where in that one liner that an orphan is nothing if not useful, and that does sort of contextualize things. And so something about the conditionality of that sets up maybe a relationship with other humans at large that doesn't come that isn't the same as maybe having the unconditional atmosphere of a traditional setting. And so that's where I've learned that my psychological tunings are not necessarily shared by everybody. And so my relationship to the general group of mankind has been more outsider because that. But I suppose the upside of that is it's also been more independent, you know.
Yeah, my wife called me out, within the last couple of months. She said sometimes I make comments that just reflect like this anti-establishment stance, and I'll make the comment without researching it, or like there was one, where we were talking. It was a while ago. Talking about Joe Biden and whether he was going to run again, and I said something like, "Well, he's not even running the country anyway." And she immediately, because she likes to be specific, and so her
Yeah.
reaction was like, "Okay, who's running it?" Right? And I'm like, okay, I could make stuff up, I could guess, I could conjecture, but I actually don't know, and it could be him, and he might just be phoning it in or whatever.
I'm
Like
not sure you have to know the answer to that question to still find
but
the
the
question
point
a reasonable one.
the point is my thrownness to just take that kind of anti or contrarian position, and it just made me more self-aware that sometimes I just say stuff because it's opposed to whatever the consensus is.
Okay.
And we might share that, right?
Uh-huh. Well, see, what I would say is for me, it's pattern recognition. And that I have, because of my setting, I've been forced to pay attention to certain signals in the pattern that other people who came from more unconditional settings might not have sensitivity around. So maybe that shows up as making me more suspicious of other humans. On the other hand, I have also made it a study of other humans.
You've
And so I
you've
feel
also
very
justified your
strong and
suspicion. Yeah.
I feel very strong. And also because there is a certain you do have to develop a certain bracketing instinct. You do have to know what noise you put in against the signal. And then that's one of the good things about being old is that you've got a lot of statistical sample to adjust your model and to realize, "Oh, okay, yeah, I tend to do that," as you're saying now.
Yeah.
But once you integrate those, it's just a question of those dials to get the levels right of the signals that you are picking up,
Yeah.
right? And I think that this has got to do a lot with, yes, there is a madness of crowds, but there is also this thing. What was the word? Sensus communitatis is the old Latin that we translate as common
Common sense. Yeah.
sense. But I guess it means a little bit more than that, that it actually has a kind of a depth. It doesn't just mean get out of the rain when it's raining. And it kind of stretches into that idea that I think Gadamer talked about taste, and taste sort of being a distillation of a general common sense that that is different than just going for fashion. And my feeling is that we do only a part of the information that we're processing is sticking up above the water. The rest of it is that iceberg that's underneath there. And maybe this connects to martial arts too, because I do think it's a whole bodied thing. I don't think it's just a brain thing. I don't think it's just a left brain thing. um, that there is a vibrational component to things, and that the better you've integrated all those into your meter, the more consistent your results get. And I do think it's something you have to put like some attention to. Like if you're not curious and you're happy to just bang along the same pathway, then this might all just remain mysterious forever. I'm not going to rule that out. But my feeling is that, if you look at it from the science side, and you look at it from the philosophical theoretical side, and you look at it from the inside through, there's more than one avenue to do that. It isn't all just introspection. Ceremonies is an example of that, and understanding or maybe looking with your dreams is part of that. Uh, but there's this idea that there's a lot of different angles that one can look at to understand the mechanism of self, and that there is a tunability. This is one of the great lies of postmodernism, as we touched on before, and that is that because all views are valid within their setting, does not give all views equal claim to some sort of more absolute truth. And the understanding of that is pretty clear on a functional sense. And that is that from our youth into our adulthood, we seem to get smarter about stuff. It
Well,
wasn't that our younger viewpoints were invalid. They were just chapter appropriate, and we've grown out of them. And our new viewpoints are really an update and a closer picture of reality and more functional and more sustainable and all these things that we're after in this directional thing than they were when you were 6,
yeah.
right?
I mean, as soon as somebody says my lived experience is dot dot dot, and then proposes that therefore they're speaking objective truth, or they're kind of um, applying their subjective experience in a way that others should hear it as an objective truth. Like my lived experience is that, the obvious one is racism is rampant in the United States or whatever. Well, but that doesn't mean that the statistics prove that out, right?
Right, right. And I think that that's also the danger that we run when we no longer respect the authority of elders. Not that it's an absolute authority, but it's a perspective that carries some signal that's worth integrating into the model based on whatever, right? And that is that you might express that your lived experience is X or Y, and an elder with more perspective might look back and say, yes, that is the lived experience of chapter 3. And that's a natural progression into, guess what? Chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, dot 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 dot. That doesn't mean that chapter 3 is the absolute truth of all reality. And God knows you're not going to live as if it is. Right? So, I mean, if you are, you're not going to function. It's not sustainable, right?
Right.
So, so we have to unfold that though. What is that really going on? Really, it's saying that, well, I don't feel heard. I don't feel, empowered in the chapter that I'm in. I'm a little bit like I don't know where the direction is of the next chapter, and so I'm going to cling to today's chapter, which is a very human, very natural thing to do, right? You're going to hold on to the vine until it's time to let go to grab the next vine. And there are cases where people swing back and forth on the same vine for some psycho emotional reason.
I
And
wonder
that's a
if
real
we
thing
could
for them, right?
I wonder if we could play that out a little bit. And this is getting into maybe taxonomy land and problematic, but somebody who misunderstands postmodernism or internalizes the postmodern mistake that viewpoints having equivalent value within their own contexts means that they have equal claim to absolute truth, or proximity to absolute truth. If somebody believes that because they're in chapter 3 and they gain power,
Uh-huh.
or they and their friends who believe that together gain power, they build, let's say, a Marxist society, right? They build a society that privileges egalitarianism over, let's say, merit or um,
Competence.
competence, yeah,
Yeah.
or
Well,
wisdom,
see, well,
or
see, here's the thing. They're probably not going to say that they have as much claim to absolute truth as anybody else, because in their universe there is no absolute truth. And there no one's claim to truth is more valid than anyone else's claim to truth is their story. And yet they're not doing stuff the way they were when they were 12. And if they're 30 now, if they've made it this far with that kind of a worldview, they probably can glimpse down the road and get an idea that things are going to look different at 40 and at 50 and at 60 if they've had children and if they've worked in a career and if they've been through the experience of life. So that it's like these things are sort of in transition. And
so what is
but I
the
think
psychological state? Like what would the DSM say about a person in their 30s that has that worldview. Is that
Postmodern syndrome.
yeah.
Um,
Is
well,
that a form of narcissism?
no, I think that postmodernism is based around critique. And I'm a great fan of critique, right? Because without critique, we can't move forward. And I'm a great fan of moving forward, right? Um, but we can't blur things. So, for example, there being no absolute truth. Okay, great, but that doesn't mean that there's not a better and a worse, a more functional and a less functional. I'm an American. I'm pragmatic. I want to see corn grow, and it turns out that not all worldviews are equal in growing corn. Some worldviews are grow corn because they've been based on growing corn. And it's a very pragmatic, it's a phronesis based in practice. And so this is one of the problems. And this is why, postmodernism came out as a reaction to continental philosophy. And the thing about continental philosophy is these people haven't grown enough corn. Basically, they don't have an instinct for where the rubber meets the road. They're sort of up in a removed intellectual, and yes, there is a distinction can be made between the realm of mind and the realm of matter, but they're not different. That's the fundamental mystery, right? That's what the Tao is trying to tell us in the very beginning. Yes, we give them different names, but they're not different.
I wonder if you could explain that some more. We've touched on it in the past, but if not explain, maybe describe is a better request.
Well, I think we've talked about this idea that um okay, when Jeff was giving us the rap about the great chain of being, right? Now, he conceives it as coming from the bottom to the top, and the classical way going back to probably Aristotle or the pre-Aristotelians have this idea of it coming from the top down. But whichever way you do it, there's like three inescapable things, and they are spaces between steps on that chain. And that is from dead stuff to live stuff, from live unconscious stuff to live conscious stuff, and from live conscious stuff to live conscious stuff that's conscious of its consciousness. And those mysteries, the trans the transition between those mysteries are
And
fundamental mysteries.
no stuff to stuff.
And
There's
no
one
stuff
more.
the stuff might be down at the very
Yeah.
bottom. Yeah.
Oh,
Or
uh,
the top.
it's at the bottom of that staircase, but as Jeff said, there are more stairs below that natural language does not attend to,
Right.
apprehend, right?
Under the turtles.
Right. Um, or under the physics. Like he in the book he talks about let's not get into quantum mechanics because nobody really understands it.
But the randomness idea is pretty sketch.
That
Yeah.
the universe is actually a probability and the this that completely reinforms the idea that we're continually going from the probabilistic to the real and
Right.
and that makes something about this moment actually pretty special and
Absolutely.
yeah and that matter is really just all probabilities anyway is kind of maybe important.
Well, and I think that, this is where we get to Henri Bergson, and who kind of reworked the idea of evolution in a work that he called creative evolution. And he came up with this concept that I think is just a French word for Hun Yuan Qi, which I've mentioned in our earlier episodes, that the force of the universe which keeps everything orchestrated, all the bugs bugging at the right times and all the plants flowering and all that, the gears all meshing together. And that's his explanation for how we connect across that gap. Whether we're connecting from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom, the mystery remains fundamental in there. And what he comes his French word for it is élan vital, like vital, right? Élan vital. And we can sort of of it as as a creative impulse, or the impulse to life, or the impulse to higher order, or and he says, when he proposes this, he says, I'm not telling you anything. This name is just a placeholder for the mystery. We're not filling in the mystery. It's just a signpost of our ignorance.
Naming it is worth something, though.
But being able to point to it, and even if it's just to say WTF, it's on the map where we know something's at work. And so the idea that what's at work here is this, if we want to go back to the ancients and say, well, that's what they were talking about, uh, then they were getting there from philosophy. I would argue, though, that they're getting there from the mysteries, and that they were doing things and had practices that were non-ordinary, consciousness oriented, where they saw certain things directly, which I believe is a capacity of the human mind. And I think that's actually the story of revealed religion. And that all the problems come because when you have a version of this experience, this is not readily flattenable into language.
Is that what you mean by revealed religion? Like somebody has a
Revelation.
religious experience and then tries to transmit it through non-religious means, and that doesn't work.
Because the Tao which can be spoken is not the true Tao, and
Right.
the names which can be given are not the true names. That's why the Zen master hits you, because he can't explain it. He's
Lessons
pointing
out
at
there.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. He's pointing at it and he's going, right there, right, whack, that's why your abuela hits you with the chanclas. She wants you to see directly into the matter, right? In that brilliant flash of wisdom and insight,
So,
right?
so tie these mysteries, the Elan Vital, back to your comment about mind and matter seem like separate things, but are actually the same thing. Can you?
Well, don't they meet in the human? And isn't that the fundamental mystery of human life, is this meeting of the two realms? And that are they different? Are they the same? We can make distinctions in language, but they're fused together. And but this idea of mutually interpenetrating dual directional manifestation is sort of implied here, that form comes down from the top and the building blocks of form build up from the bottom, and that but that the essence to make those miraculous leaps has to come from a quickening that comes from above. And that's why Finnegan woke up. That's the only reason he was able to.
Mm,
And that's the idea of saying that humans are capable of experiencing higher realities than they're capable of reasoning themselves to. And those are the mysteries.
yeah,
And
the myth.
when you read Plato, and at some point he just says, well, those are the mysteries, you know. Or linguistic philosophers might say, well, that's above my pay grade, you know. Or Corindero might say, well, just drink this.
Right.
Yeah. But that's still not a guarantee that you will see.
No, no.
Yeah. And so but this idea that, we've talked about a moral or an ethical career the becoming chunsu, the perfecting of ourselves through ripening and coming to completion. And it seems to me that that mystery is reflected in that phenomenon, in that it is through a refinement of our inner sensibilities that we enhance our ability to manifest what's around us. So that to be capable of manifesting a peaceful environment, or an environment that enables growth and thriving, that's an outer state that's a reflection of an inner condition. And yet there's a push pull between there. So yeah, you can go to a Zen monastery where a lot of mind has distilled itself and manifested into this environment that's conducive to itself. And you can go there and you can get a little hit of that. But the idea is you are the mind to matter transmutation machine. So, which is what an artist is trying to do, to take an image and to make it real and live. That's what I interpreted that crossing the chasm is.
Yeah,
So
taking any idea and manifesting it. Yeah.
so that it lives in the world, which means that it isn't just a dead matter, but that somehow it exists on these higher levels also. The piece of art won't persist unless it carries a higher thing. I was thinking of Guernica and by Picasso, and how
I got to see
it,
it last year.
and it was in one of these halls when the politicos came out to announce a war, and it happened to be right behind them while they're trying to announce this war. So they had someone hang a curtain over it so they could announce their war without having that incredible, powerful, psycho emotional statement about war right behind him, even though the artist has been dead how long? And the message, the vision, the emotional communication of that piece of work, we just can't have that behind us as a backdrop for the shit we're trying to pull off right now. you know, wow, that's pretty good. Talk about a hand reaching from the grave. Good job. And then it sort of speaks to art and how art can lift us up centuries later. That there is something timeless in that. Well, that means it's not just matter if it's timeless.
I just had this experience. I was at the Getty. I think I mentioned this in another episode recently, but I was in LA with Ray, and we went to the Getty, and I saw a painting of Monet's of the cathedral at Rouen, and I'd never seen it before. Maybe I saw it in a book at some point, and it was small, and I turned the page.
Sure.
But like the incredible lack of detail in this impressionistic painting, combined with the vision that it presents of this cathedral against the clouds. It's like almost, the shining city on the hill metaphor, with like a little orange here and some,
Right.
some beige there, and like,
Right.
mind blowing. It was mind
Yep.
blowing. It was a minor religious experience to get to stare at it for a minute.
A little aha. Yeah. And then if you really want to push that, check out the Fauve painters, right? Fauve was when they started the impressionists, and they started breaking away from the salon, the sensibilities of the salon. And I can't remember who it was. If I'll dig it out and put it in the show notes, but it was one of these new impressionist things hanging amongst the old ideas. And a famous critic exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's," or maybe it was a classic guy in the midst of it. He said, "Oh my God, it's so and such amongst the foe of the beasts." They've just gone wild. They've gone wild, right? Well, a buddy of mine who is a fauve painter nowadays, Boston Art Institute and all that, who's also a Tai Chi guy, he explained to me, he said, we're not painting what you see, because a camera can do that much better and quicker and easier and cheaper and all that. We're painting the charge. We're painting the energy of the situation. That's why the landscape of New Mexico, the hillside, is red. Not because it's red when you look at it, it's red because the sun and the intensity and et cetera, et cetera. And so this idea of understanding the charge of color for its psycho-emotional impact and not just its ability to render what you see. And that's why I started trying to paint mountains because of the green tones. And I was just thinking of it as a machine that you put your energy into and you get your energy back out in a kind of a changed condition. And that the greens and blues, what they do is they sort of chill. It's like a little meditation machine you can put on your wall and it just sort of kind of brings it all down, which is exactly the opposite if you were to paint the whole room red. Right? And they're colors that are complementary colors. You paint them both on top of each other, you get gray. They kinda cancel out. Well, because they sit on opposite, whole mystery there that, Goethe was one of the first ones to start going into, and also, uh, anyway, some of these famous sciencey guys, who worked with optics. I think Newton maybe also had a color theory in
Mm.
there during the plague when he had to chill
Uh-huh.
inside.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder if I love the diversion to art because it kind of touches a unexpected facet of this topic about the individual psyche and its relationship to the collective. Um, and we also talked about what might happen if somebody takes the wrong um, the wrong thing as truth and then comes to power. Uh, what do you think? Um, like, I think you mentioned mental contagion earlier and the madness of crowds, and I think we touched on how we are leave ourselves open to that. But what do you think about the okay, and one more just to build it, and we've talked about things like modernism or rationalism resulting in a godless society and therefore an amoral one, right? With mechanized destruction being the outcome.
Mhm. Or
So
maybe heartless is a more secular way to present
yeah,
that.
yeah. Um,
Yeah.
what would Jeff say? Um, spiritless, still, yeah. But what what about this kind of universe of individual dysfunction as it relates to this parallel universe of collective dysfunction and the relationship between them? You said something at the beginning about part whole, and maybe that's the thing to come back to.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with, different analyses show that so many people are sort of authoritarian personalities, and so as long as the argument is presented in an authoritarian way, they won't think twice. And then I'm sure at the other end of the spectrum, you have the contrarians that whenever anything's presented with authority, they're definitely going to, poke at it, which is maybe a healthier
But I'm less
instinct.
concerned with the person presented to and more concerned with the person who is presenting. Because
Well, see, that's
because
what I was gonna say, is those people get chosen by what harmonized with the greatest number of people. If you've got a society that is creating the psychological conditions that tend to foment authoritarian personality types, then you've got a good chance that you're gonna have a higher probabilistic setting for that. Um,
so can we
y y
say anything about how society does and doesn't foment particular personality traits?
Well, I think the general thing is that if you and I've talked about this in relation to Plato's Republic and the idea of, do you have philosopher kings in charge or do you have the bronze characters, which is to say basically merchants? And the merchant is focused on the material realm of things and not on the higher aspects. And so when you have a materialistic society, its message is going to be, hey, look at this matter. Look at this matter and this matter. Here's this other kind of matter. There's a new kind of matter. Did you ever see matter this color? How about this color? How about this? And everything will tend to become commodified. And it's likely that its higher aspects are not going to be appreciated.
The taxonomist in me loves that because it provides a framework that there's like a materialist or a post-materialist. Maybe that's matter and mind, back to that framework.
Right. And
Um,
we have a two-part rock and roll reference, Californication and Hotel California.
mhm.
Strangely, the same word is involved in both of those.
Yeah, yeah,
They talk about the same phenomenon, don't they?
yeah. So I like that framework because it basically says all of this psychological dysfunction has some relationship to materialism and is potentially contextualized or healed or cured or worked with by bringing in spirit, by bringing in mind, not just matter. Is
Well,
that
see, and this plugs into one of those mysteries. One mystery is, dead and alive. One mystery is alive and unconscious and alive and conscious. But the mystery of consciousness and consciousness conscious of consciousness. Okay, your dog's conscious, but he doesn't have the option to really be conscious of the fact that he's conscious. He doesn't even know he's a dog. He probably thinks he's just like you. He's going to grow up someday, get to sit at the table, drive the car, the whole thing. What does he know, right? But but as a human, we move between those two. There's times when we are just conscious, and that so much so that people doubt free will even exists, right? And yet there are times when we do in practices and experiences that can lead us to be conscious of our consciousness. And we realize that maybe there's a vacillation back and forth there, and that
and
there
does
might
one
be a trick.
correspond to materialism and the other correspond to post-materialism or to the world of spirit?
Maybe loosely, because when we're just conscious, we tend to be on a kind of an autopilot, and we maybe are running more on instinct, which means that maybe we're running off of those lower emotions than the higher emotions. We're rooted in that will to receive, and the idea of the will to bestow, or any of those higher things. We kind of lapse out of that, and that's when the Zen master is supposed to hit us with the stick, right? But but I think that a big piece of it is just, does the culture reinforce looking in, or does it kind of wince away when indications are made that way? And I don't think it's a yes or no. I think there's always these forces that are going back, and that's one of the roles of art, is to kind of, okay, I want to look away, but there's this, look at this, there's a deeper level. And I don't just mean the art that makes you wince. I mean the beautiful art too. And I might argue that the beautiful art does it better than the art that makes you wince, because it opens up our senses to these higher things instead of jabbing it, right? And not that all art doesn't have some place. I mean, I suppose somehow there's some room for some motherfucker to be taping bananas to the wall. Maybe there's some argument for that. Uh, uh, I don't want to make a mistake, so I'm going to leave it open in
It
that regard.
happened.
Not my cup of
So
tea, but
so it's part of the story. It's part
part of
of
the
the
story.
human story now. So we
Exactly.
it's in the mix.
Exactly, exactly. But I've been learning and studying about markets and market trend analysis and stuff like that. And the ahas that I've been having about that is that it's another thing that's it's an interaction of will and mind, fear, desire primarily, and stuff and matter. And you watch the relationship of it go like this. And then there's interesting things like, a lot of analysts, they like the Fibonacci numbers. But to know whether the Fibonacci numbers are real is almost impossible because they all like the Fibonacci numbers. So they all trade based on the Fibonacci numbers. So, son of a gun, look, it seems like things happen around these Fibonacci numbers. And so there's an egg or a chicken egg
Right.
horse cart problem here because it's the interaction of mind and matter.
Yeah.
Can we be completely scientific about it like it's a natural science when so many human emotions are involved? And isn't that, again, that struggle between the two halves of the brain? And we can totalize this. No, you can't. Yeah, we can. We can totalize it sometimes. But that turns out it's not totalizing it, is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's sometimesing it.
That ought to be a rock and roll reference. We can totalize it sometimes, but it'll just be a Brian Lee reference. There
I
was something
guess
you
it'll
said
have.
earlier that I just have to come back to. The quest for certainty is a fool's errand, and there was such an opportunity there for me to have said, "But not these fools."
Not
So
these fools,
maybe Rebecca
no.
can edit that together.
Yeah.
In
Some fools, is some fools errands. That's
the
what you wanna say,
yeah,
yes. Or a small f fools,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah. Right, right. Cool. Well, that was fun. I actually really love the mental model of materialism and post-materialism being kind of the framework that that ideologies and political systems live in. That they're either materialist or both, and
Right.
the impact that they'll have is going to reflect that. And then all the arrays of personality types that I was wanting to like kind of think about earlier slot in there. So
Yeah.
yeah, um,
And this is not new, right? People are like, "Oh, materialism," well, this message was one that Plato wrote the repu or, yeah, Plato wrote the Republic about in 300 and change BC.
yeah.
So these basic problems, these aspects, this is a term I heard used that I really liked. I'm going to steal it. These issues are evergreen.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's a
That's
good
in
way
the
to put it.
parlance. Yeah,
It is,
yeah.
yes.
Um, cool. Well, and then green field is yet another thing, but we'll work that into the next episode. Um, Thank you, Brian. That was fun.
Absolutely. That was a fun one too.